Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
What is good is what is pleasurable. What is bad is what is painful.
Epicurus and the Good Life.
When I was 17, it was a very good year.
Are freedom from fear and absence of pain truly the marks of the good life?
When I was 35, it was a very good year.
Isn't Epicurus all about sensual pleasure?
But now the days are short.
What does it mean to live a happy, tranquil life?
Our guest is David Konstan from NYU.
Epicurus and the Good Life.
Live long and prosper.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're coming to you from the studios of KALW San Francisco,
where we continue conversations that began at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus, where Ken and I are professors of philosophy.
Today's conversation is about Epicurus and the good life.
In common parlance, an Epicurean is someone who is, quote, fond of luxury or indulgence in sensual pleasures. The Epicurean has luxurious tastes or habits, especially in eating and drinking.
But, you know, the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who we're going to talk about today, was decidedly not an Epicurean in that sense of the word. His philosophy is actually pretty far removed from Epicureanism as ordinarily understood.
Epicurus acknowledged that desires for good food and fine wine were perfectly natural. But he actually dismissed these desires as unnecessary and argued that pursuing them could set you up for a life of disappointment, of pain, of anxiety and distress.
The real key to human happiness, on his view at least, is avoiding bodily pain and mental distress. It's not in positively pursuing luxury and excessive sensual pleasures.
We don't want to make it sound like Epicurus was opposed to the pursuit of pleasure. He just thought that we should pursue pleasures of the right kind. These would be pleasures brought about by the satisfaction of what he called our natural and necessary desires. Simple things like the desire for food or the company of good friends. Or, as you put it, Ken, the desire for avoiding physical pain and mental distress.
You know, John, calling some desires natural and necessary suggests that other desires are unnatural and or unnecessary.
Exactly right. We already gave one example of a natural but unnecessary desire, the desire for fine food and drink. An example of a completely unnatural desire is the desire for immortality, a desire born, according to Epicurus, of the unreasonable fear of death.
Unreasonable? Unnatural? Look, the desire not to die seems like the most natural thing in the world. And it seems, perfectly natural too, I would think.
You think it's rational? Well, not according to Epicurus. It just gets in the way. It prevents us from living well. The desire for immortality is, after all, certain to go unsatisfied. Unsatisfied desires are the main cause of pain and anxiety. One of Epicurus's main philosophical aims was to help people free themselves from such desires, to refocus on the simple and easy pleasures that come from satisfying our natural and necessary desires.
So if we just rid ourselves of things like the desire for immortality, face death with equanimity, everything's going to be all right? Is that the idea?
You got it, Ken.
I don't buy it. Look, Epicurus needs to read his Shakespeare. Death is the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. It puzzles the will, makes cowards of us all. In other words, it's intrinsically and naturally loathsome. It's quite reasonable to fear death.
Geez, Ken, quoting Hamlet? Hamlet is your poster child for the true path to happiness? Hamlet just proves Epicurus's point. Ask yourself why Hamlet, who was a prince after all, finds the slings and arrows of his, quote, outrageous fortune so unbearable. It's partly because his fear that death would be even more unbearable than life adds to his already high level of anxiety. So he whines on and on about his life, and his whining prevents him from taking action and taking pleasure in his life.
Well, Hamlet has a point, doesn't he? Look, as bad as life may be, death is worse, infinitely worse. It does last forever, John.
No, he doesn't have a point. Look, I admit that the act of dying, the process of dying, can be a bad thing. Who wants to die in a horrible and painful fashion, or in some fruitless, forlorn war? But the state of being dead? That's neither a good nor a bad thing. It's a non-thing. When Hamlet dies, he doesn't have any more experiences. He doesn't start having awful experiences. He doesn't continue to have great experiences. He's just gone. Once Hamlet is dead, there's no Hamlet left to experience either suffering or joy.
That's supposed to be a comforting thought, John. Jeepers. People find the prospect of infinite oblivion horrifying. We find it so horrifying that, you know what we did? We invented the afterlife to diminish the horror.
Well, that's confusion and false comfort and pointless to boot. People should be no more horrified by the infinite oblivion that follows death than by the infinite oblivion that preceded birth. The one is no better and no worse than the other.
I see your point, sort of. But I do see that there's a lot to talk about here. Epicurus may not be an Epicurean in the common meaning of that word, but he's certainly a fascinating, provocative philosopher.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface, Ken. Epicurus is intriguing, he's profound, he's widely influential, and widely misunderstood.
Since pleasure and pain are such key elements in Epicurus' thinking, we sent our roving philosophical reporter, Caitlin Esch, to find some modern scientific explanations of that pair. She files this report.
For Epicurus, pleasure was the absence of pain and suffering. For the rest of us, pleasure might be the feeling we get from a warm day at the beach, or a chocolate bar, or a lover's kiss. But what is pleasure to a neurologist, like UCSF professor Howard Fields?
Well, a specific subset of neurons that are connected to each other are activated in a particular temporal sequence. And that pattern of activity is interpreted as feeling good.
If that's pleasure, then what is pain?
Ooh, pain is sort of the opposite.
Jennifer Mitchell's the clinical project director at the Ernest Gallo Clinic and Research Center.
Some people like to think of these as a continuum, where on one side is pain, on the other side is pleasure, and then everything that you do is somewhere in between.
Mitchell studies the brains of alcoholics. She's the lead author of a new paper looking at the effects of drinking on the pleasure circuits of the brain. First, she recruited 25 subjects through an ad on Craigslist.
It said, are you a social drinker? Would you like to be in our study?
She brought them to the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. There, she scanned their brains using positron emission tomography, or PET scans.
And then we give them a double shot, pretty much.
Then she scanned their brains again. After comparing the before and after shots, her team discovered something that had never been shown in humans before.
We found that alcohol induces the release of endorphins in your brain, and it does that in a couple of very important places that have been previously associated with pleasure.
In other words, the researchers proved what people have known for a long time. Alcohol makes you feel good. But that wasn't Mitchell's ultimate goal. The discovery could help develop a drug that blocks that good feeling you get from a glass of wine. A drug that could potentially take away an alcoholic's drive to keep drinking.
Exactly. So it is like a little bit of a pleasure blocker. And obviously we would like it to be super specific so that pleasure in general is not taken away.
Which raises the question, why seek pleasure through excessive drinking, eating, or other behaviors if you know it's bad for you in the long run, if it ultimately reduces your happiness? Again, Howard Fields from UCSF.
The inability to delay gratification is what we call impulsivity, and there definitely is a genetic predisposition to impulsivity.
Drug addicts and alcoholics are more impulsive than normals, Fields says. But what about people who actually seem to choose pain over pleasure, like sadomasochists, or people who just make bad choices? Fields points to a well-known experiment by the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov. A scientist rings a bell before feeding a group of dogs. Eventually, the dogs begin to associate the bell with food, and they salivate whenever they hear it.
So instead of using a bell, he used pinching of the paw as the signal. Right. So initially, when you pinch a dog's paw, it's going to pull the paw away, it's going to bark, it's going to try to bite your hand and stop it.
But eventually, after pinching the paws of hungry dogs and feeding them over and over again, their behavior starts to change. They begin to salivate whenever their paws are pinched.
One could imagine that what the dogs were feeling with the paw pinch was not the pain so much as an indication that something good was going to happen. There's got to be some element that's rewarding for the painful stimulus itself to be sought out.
In other words, dogs, like people, will choose pain when it leads to greater pleasure. How Epicurean. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Caitlin Esch.
Paws, pinching, Pavlov, and pain. Thanks for that interesting report, Caitlin. I'm John Perry. With me is my fellow Stanford philosopher, Ken Taylor.
And today we're discussing Epicurus and the good life. We're joined now by David Konstan. He's professor of classics at New York University. He's author of A Life Worthy of the Gods, The Materialist Psychology of Epicurus. David, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Hello, it's a pleasure to join you.
David, let me ask you where you think Epicurus stacks up in the pantheon of great dead philosophers from Plato to Kant.
Well, he has one obstacle to overcome, which is that his own writings survive only in a fragmentary condition, or cited sometimes by his enemies. But I would put him well above where he's typically located. The big shots from antiquity are Plato and Aristotle, and we have lots of their stuff. With Epicurus and the Stoics, and particularly Epicurus, we have a lot less from the original source. But we do have one compensating thing, which is a long Latin poem by Lucretius that is beautiful and also sums up much of the doctrine, but not all of it.
So how did you personally come to be so fascinated by his work? He seems to me like a very puzzling, interesting, intriguing fellow. But how did you come to be fascinated by his work?
Well, I think there were three currents. One is I have a strange career. Before, my undergraduate degree is in mathematics, and it's only then that I went into ancient Greek and Latin. So, as we will probably discuss later on, there's a very interesting and important physical theory that lies behind the ethics of Epicurus. Then, because I was studying Latin, I got interested in Lucretius and slowly realized I couldn't treat him just as a poet. I had to understand the philosophy too. And then finally, I had a friend who was in therapy with a woman who believed that we were all afraid of death and that's what was causing us to be so miserable. And this coincided with the philosophy of Epicurus, as you were discussing earlier in the show, in this remarkable way. And so I wanted to know more about his beliefs.
So Ken and I talked a bit about Epicurus's view about the role of different desires in a well-lived human life. But you've alluded to the fact that he seems to have had a massive and interconnected system of philosophy. Can you tell us briefly how his views about the well-lived life fit into this overall philosophical system?
Yes. You were quoting Hamlet earlier and his great soliloquy about to be or not to be, and one recalls that he thought death might be a solution until he said, "Death is like sleep, to sleep perchance to dream." And that was the danger, that after death there would still be not just survival, but the danger of punishment and pain, things we have to endure as we are eaten by worms and maybe punished by vengeful gods. That idea obsessed Epicurus, and he thought that it really did rid us of many of the simple pleasures that we could enjoy in life. So that in order really to free us to have a body free from pain and a mind free to enjoy itself and free of fear, we had first to rid ourselves of any suspicion that the soul could survive after the dissolution of the body and be subject to such torments. And to do that, he developed this materialist system that I referred to in the title of my book, The Materialist Psychology, which said the world is made up of atoms and void, and when we die, there are no soul substances, there are no ghosts, there are no mysterious, ethereal elements that could survive the dissolution of the body. It's all over. And that's the way in which his scientific theory meshes with his psychology.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Today we're talking about Epicurus and the good life with David Konstan from New York University.
Is the Epicurean concept of a well-lived life one that you yourself might choose? Is Epicurus right in thinking that getting over the fear of death and the desire for immortality is a key to human flourishing?
Epicurus on the Good Life, when Philosophy Talk continues.
A life free of pain, a life worthy of a king? We're talking about pleasure and pain in the ancient thought of Epicurus. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor.
Our guest is David Konstan from NYU. He's the author of A Life Worthy of the Gods, the Materialist Psychology of Epicurus.
So let's talk about pleasure and pain and their roles in a well-lived life as conceived by Epicurus. Would it be fair to call Epicurus a kind of hedonist, a person who believes that pleasure and only pleasure is intrinsically valuable and that pain and only pain intrinsically lacks value? Is he a hedonist of some kind?
I think that's accurate, but it needs a bit of specification. I think what Epicurus meant was that we are naturally attracted to anything that is pleasurable, and we are naturally averse to anything that is painful. Obviously, we can calculate that certain pains are to be endured for a greater pleasure. This is why we have reason, but instinctively, no one would say that we're attracted to putting our hand in a fire, and no one would say that we are repelled at a nice, pleasurable sensation such as eating when you're hungry.
But here's the thing that confuses me a little bit. If pain is intrinsically bad, pleasure is intrinsically good. I mean, isn't the pleasure of a very fine wine then something worth pursuing? But he seemed to think we shouldn't pursue such things.
Well, he thinks in the case of a pleasure of a fine wine that it's not necessary, but it's a nice variation on the pleasures that we actually do require. So he has two kinds of pleasures that he's identified. One was a kind of mobile pleasure, a pleasure in motion, as when you're hungry and then you suddenly remove some of that hunger and you feel better as you're eating until you reach a state where you're fine. In the case of something like a pleasant odor, a perfume, or a fine wine, no such process of change is going on. It's just static. We like it. We can take it or leave it, and there's no harm in it.
Well, let's cut to the chase. What's on everyone's mind. How did Epicurus feel about romance and sex?
He said about sex, and romance in particular, it never did anyone any good, and it often leads to harmful consequences. That, by and large, the kind of passionate falling in love, the sense that you can't live without that other person, that you absolutely have to have the person, the suffering, the obsessive thoughts that accompanying real falling in love, what the Greeks called eros, or the erotic experience, they, like many other Greeks, it has to be said, thought this could significantly make life uncomfortable.
But
so on the whole, they were against it.
So, David, this is what I'm trying to understand. So, Epicurus was a kind of hedonist. You said it had to be qualified. But these natural, but as he called them, unnecessary pleasures, those some people think are the highest pleasures, the pleasures most worth pursuing. Maybe they're luxury, you mean because they go beyond what's necessary, but who wants to live a life of bare necessity, right? We want more than the bare necessities. What was his problem with these things which were natural but unnecessary? Because he seemed to think you should not spend your life devoted to pursuit of them.
Well, devoted to the pursuit of it, you're right. He didn't think that was a good idea if it would lead you to sacrifice all other more available pleasures. But among the things that Epicurus thought were most important were friendship. He has this lovely saying that friendship goes dancing round the world. He thought that thinking and discussing and the pleasures of community were extremely important, so he left plenty of room for fine social pleasures. If your only ambition is to own a wine that costs $100,000 and you haven't got $100,000 and you feel perpetually deprived, then Epicurus asked, what's going on? Can I offer an explanation for what would make a person miserable just because she or he didn't have that thing? And wine is one example, but there are others that are still more pressing. For example, the $1 billion, the need to win the lottery, a huge amount of power, the ability to strut and give orders to somebody else. What pleasure comes from that? And why are people so obsessed with it that they will sometimes ruin their own lives and recognize that they're doing so out of a kind of addiction to this power and status and fame and wealth? That's the question.
It sounds to me like if Epicurus were alive today, he might be ever so slightly skeptical of some of the basic tenets of modern economy, like consume, 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 and everybody will be happy.
He would absolutely be just that. He would wonder why it is that our economy is dedicated to promoting desires, even creating desires where they hadn't existed before. And by the way, there was a slightly earlier contemporary of Epicurus, a school of philosophers, who believed exactly that. They said it's the satisfying of desires that gives us pleasure, and that's the only thing that gives us pleasure. And so what we ought to do is increase our desires and add to our desires. And it was something like this that Epicurus was opposing, a kind of early consumerism, if you like.
But let me ask you a question.
David,
let me ask you a question. So, I mean, the Stoics were into renouncing desires of certain kinds. But now, I'm not a great historian of philosophy. I understood the Epicureans and the Stoics were kind of at odds about things, that the Stoics had lots of criticisms of, but they sound very similar, right?
Well, the Stoics placed as the highest goal virtue. And they had an elaborate notion of a kind of divinely governed universe, which was a rationality permeated the whole universe. And the way a human being achieved happiness was to have our own minds completely in tune with this larger, rational, you might almost call it God-inhabited universe. And here's where the Epicureans parted company. They don't talk much about virtues at all, and their primary interest lies elsewhere. For them, the universe, as I said, is material, and it has no purpose. It has no goal. It is not permeated by rationality in the least. And to fill in the picture, they did believe there were gods, but they held that the gods have no interest in human beings.
So for the Stoics, it looked to us, superficially perhaps, like the world was governed by mere fortune, but it actually was governed by providence. It was actually not.
Exactly.
Right. But for the Epicureans, it actually is governed by fortune, by mere fortune. And this is a way to live in the face of mere fortune or something like that?
That's exactly right. If you have a universe that doesn't care about you, wasn't made for you, a world, a planet like our own, where certain regions are uninhabitable, where there are dangerous animals ready to tear us to pieces, where all kinds of obstacles to our satisfactions exist. We're capable of overcoming them within limits, but this was clearly not a world built around us. And in fact, it wasn't built around anything. It is a random collections of atoms that course through space, and when enough of them accumulate, they form a kind of local universe with which the Epicureans made a great effort to explain in a kind of primitive but still fascinating physics. So how they had to explain, without the knowledge of forces and all of the many achievements of modern science, they did, including microscopes, for example, they had to explain how a universe made up of atoms and void could work. But however it worked, it didn't work for our sakes.
Right.
And we're in there, and we have to find our way.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about Epicurus and the good life. And Kathleen in San Francisco is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Kathleen.
Thank you.
What's your comment or question?
Well, it just struck me that for both Epicurus and Buddha, the fear of death was a primary reason behind human misery, and that for both of them was sort of like the kickoff point for their philosophies.
Well, you're right. David, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's an interesting point, and some thinkers have in fact connected the two. You know, Epicurus lived just after the death of Alexander the Great. Alexander made it all the way to India, and he encountered what they sometimes called the naked philosophers of India, who were evidently, people get dedicated to meditation and to leading a very, very simple life. I wouldn't say that Epicurus himself was directly influenced by this tradition, although one never knows. But word of their thinking was coming back, filtering back into Greece at just this time, so that not fearing death, the only difference is that it's not even such a difference, just that the Buddhists have this notion of perpetual return to this world until you finally are capable of leaving the cycle of rebirth. That's more like Plato and not like Epicurus.
David, I want you to tell us more about the fear of death and how it works. I mean, because he's got this view that so much of our anxiety in life, so much of this ceaseless striving that we do in life, striving for fame and fortune and all that, somehow is driven by the fear of death, and it makes us worse off. Tell me more about that.
This is exactly what he does think, and it's a hard thing precisely to define, partly because of the state of our sources. But we do learn from Lucretius, that Latin poet that I mentioned, that people think of poverty as being kind of the antechamber to hell. When you are poor, they see people looking poor. It looks as though they're on the point of dying, and they feel defenseless. And so to compensate for that defenselessness, which is also motivated by their fear of death, the fear that what might happen to them afterwards, they think they need to accumulate great riches, to put those riches between themselves as a type of barrier between themselves and death. And Epicurus said at one point, when it comes to death, we all live in an unwalled city. We are all immediately vulnerable. There is no protection. And it's an unconscious belief that protection actually could be there, whether through wealth or power, that drives people. So there's a kind of allegorical quality here. We think of death as vulnerability to pain. We associate poverty and impotence with that kind of vulnerability. But instead of saying we just want enough to live well, we somehow feel we have to have more, and more. And that's where the problem arises.
So there's a lot that's strikingly contemporary about Epicurus as you describe him, at least contemporary physicalism or materialism, the idea that, atomism, no purpose, consciousness is just derives from, the activities of atoms. One thing
the soul is atomic.
Yeah. One thing that seems to be missing is evolution. So I have a two-part question. Is there any kind of suggestion of evolution in Epicurus or Lucretius? And
yes,
secondly, how do you think evolution would fit into Epicurus's philosophy? How would he react to it if he were alive today? Confirmation or undermining?
Well, what Epicurus did have was a notion of selection, which is part of evolution. What he didn't have is a notion of new species coming into being. So on the question of evolution, he believed that in the earliest phases of the Earth, when the Earth was kind of like a hot pool of mixed chemicals, not only little microscopic organisms began to form spontaneously, but even larger organisms could form. But many of them, either immediately or as the Earth became less hospitable, perished. And so whole species that might have survived or emerged early on disappeared. And the only ones that survived were those well adapted to life on our planet and presumably on other planets suitable there as well. So in this sense, he had a quasi-evolutionary theory. There was natural selection. He also had another dimension to his evolution. He did believe that human beings in the earliest stage of our existence were hardier and stronger than we are now. We tended to be more self-sufficient, the way an animal would be, another kind of animal. Very much from birth, we were physically stronger, could survive cold and heat better, but that as civilization progressed, we softened a bit. And that
David,
had a good and a bad effect.
And David, I think a part of our softening, as I understand Epicurus, was the emergence of religion, right? In this kind of early state when we didn't have all these cosmic theories about the afterlife and all that and divine justice, people were hardier. Is that right?
Well, he thought really the softening came from sex and the family. We began to love our wives. We began to pity the weak. We began to love our children, wives or husbands. We began to love our children. And at that point, we became softer. The entry of religion is a complex question. Just why people would ever start believing that we could be punished, that there were gods out there who were vengeful. Epicurus has several explanations for this. They all fit together. One thing was we had to have language. So that evolved over time. The earliest human beings merely stuttered and communicated the way animals do, but language did develop. So there's a very clear notion of the advance of civilization. That's specific. Religion entered in when people started using words for things that didn't exist.
There
We
go.
do that all the time.
Let's let a caller
We
in.
are misled by our language. You might say philosophy is the study of the pathologies of language, as
Wittgenstein would.
Epicurus is and Wittgenstein is an early proponent of this. He wants to bring language back to its original meanings.
We need
David.
some from language from our listeners.
From our
at this
listeners.
point.
Wendy in Mill Valley is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Wendy.
Thanks. I was curious how Epicurus came to be transmitted in the Middle Ages to such an extent that you have Dante placing the major heretics in hell for the sin of Epicureanism. And I don't know what that transmission is, since Lucretius's poem was not found till later.
So that's a scholarly
Yes,
question, but
No, it's a good question. He was, there's a Hebrew word which we find in the Talmud, that is to say in the commentaries on the Bible, which is an epikuros, and it means an atheist, and it's a terrible, terrible term. Now, we've already seen Epicurus wasn't an atheist. He simply believed that the gods didn't care about us. And let me add that he had a reason for that. He said, if we have gods, they must be happy. And if they care for us, they can't possibly be happy. No one who is interested in lives of human beings could be happy because we're such miserable people to care about. So you immediately have this notion that the gods are indifferent to us. And that was problematic, and the Christian writers in the West went on the attack. We only know this formula, the gods couldn't be happy if they cared about us in this specific form, from a Christian writer who was attacking Epicurus. So who he was and some of what he believed, as perceived through a Christian lens, was communicated all the way through the Middle Ages.
so the victors have narrated Epicurus for the worse, but you're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about Epicurus and the good life with David Konstan from New York University.
The modern world confronts us with a dizzying array of what Epicurus would no doubt see as unnecessary and unnatural goodies. Should we pursue them or shun them? Does Epicureanism offer a reasonable guide to modern life?
Epicureanism in our modern age of plenty, when Philosophy Talk continues.
Bees are buzzing in the tree to make some honey just for me. When you look under the rocks and plants and take a glance at the fancy ants, then maybe try a few.
In our modern age of plenty, can you still get by with just the bare necessities like Phil Harris wants us to? What would Epicurus say? I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. Our guest is David Konstan from New York University, and Paul from El Cerrito's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Paul.
Hi. I have a question and a comment first, in that my background is developmental psychology, and I see Epicurus as a very practical and natural philosopher that transcends very well to modern times, in that the hedonism behind his philosophy, I think, is very realistic, and the balance that he conveys with pleasure and pain is demonstrated every day in our psychologies. Now, my concern, though, about Epicurus, and maybe you can shed some more light on it, is his concern about extremes, that the best life is one that's void of pain, but one cannot really enjoy pleasure without having pain at the other side. I mean, they're kind of both sides, different sides of the same coin. So if you're feeling pain, if you're going less pain, then that's pleasure. But then, if it becomes monotonous if you maintain a certain status, unless you kind of increase your pain or pleasure. In that sense, your life becomes more interesting. So my question is, isn't his type of philosophy a little bit too conservative, and that if one's really going to experience the enjoyment of life, one has to risk some pain in order to enjoy the better pleasures?
Thanks for the question, Paul. What do you think about that, David?
Well, that's a very good question. Epicurus had a particular view that was often criticized in antiquity. It was that the greatest pleasure is when our bodies are in a healthy state and our minds are tranquil and free and open to enjoying the experiences we have. So what people often said was, what Epicurus is describing is a middle state. There's pain, then there's the middle state, which is neutral, and then there's pleasure. And pleasure, to get pleasure, you need some particular extra experience. Epicurus would have said, look, you can be sick or you can be healthy. When you're healthy, you're fine. It's not as though you need to be sick or need sickness in order to enjoy health. And similarly, the body doesn't need pain in order to enjoy pleasure. Pleasure consists primarily, there are also other kinds, in the elimination of pain. And he had another example which is informative.
But David,
sure.
That sounds like a kind of quietude. I mean, that's like the ultimate state is a kind of quietude in which you're not overly, striving and anxious and all that sort, and you're not in pain. Mm-hmm. But it does sound to me like a middle state. I don't see why. Because look, there are all these exhilarating things that you could see. Think of people who climb Mount Everest for the bare exhilaration of having done it, even though it costs them a lot of pain in the process. Well, where do those kinds of, moments of transcendent ecstasy fit into the Epicurean picture?
The Greeks in general, and here Epicurus was, I think, one of his people, didn't prize those adventurous experiences quite so much as we do. Climbing mountains for their own sake wasn't such a good thing. Taking ships to sea and risking your life and the waves and the storms wasn't something they really enjoyed doing, although they might do it if they wanted to become wealthy by buying a merchant ship. But then they were putting their lives at risk precisely in order to get wealthy. But when we think of what the Greeks did for adventure, and this is worth remembering, they were the greatest mercenary soldiers around until the Romans came along. They were fighting everywhere. Anybody who wanted to win a battle hired a few thousand Greeks and put them to war. And finally you got Alexander marching all the way to the ends of the world, never stopping, driving his troops until they rebelled in India and forcing them to come back where he died. And when you look at an example like his, which is the only thing he can think of, and the famous line is, he was miserable only because he had no more worlds to conquer. That was the kind of adventure and excitement and the inability to remain calm that the Epicureans focused on. What is driving you? Why do you have this need constantly to assault, to demonstrate your power, to be in the saddle, to be howling and screaming as you hurl your spear? Those were challenges actually more life-threatening than climbing any mountain, and they were characteristic of Greek life.
So, David, here's something that's characteristic of modern life, maybe not of the typical person, but of our ideal. I don't know if you watch TV, but if you watch TV, you've no doubt seen this commercial where a very attractive young lady is climbing a rock. I mean, and not just any rock, a really tall rock over in Utah or Arizona or somewhere. And she's going up the rock, and it looks incredibly uncomfortable. It must hurt. She's upside down. She's also in danger. Mm-hmm. And then finally she gets on top of the rock, and she's standing there on top of the rock looking exhilarated and a rush of adrenaline, and she's really happy. And as the commercial reminds us, in order to do this, she had to buy lots of stuff, new shoes and new rope, probably a new car. Now that's the ideal of American life. Someone in nature, physically healthy, rush of adrenaline, lots of pleasure, risk, pain, and consumerism. Now, is there an insight there that Epicurus missed, or could he help us make it through the modern world more successfully than we do?
Well, it's a very nice example, and there are certainly the pleasures of a certain type of exhilaration. But may I counter with another ad? This is one that I'm sure all of us have seen in various forms. There are a whole bunch of people on a beach, and they are smiling and laughing and jumping up and down because they have a Pepsi in their hand, or because they have a beer in a bar. And the whole focus on getting that one object, and we all know that you can sit in your room with your Pepsi or your beer, and I'm not criticizing these beverages, they're fine, and take a sip, and it's not immediately going to release all those pleasure centers that we think they will and make us feel socially acceptable and full of joy and full of laughter. That those experiences come not from owning and possessing something, but from having good friends, people you care about, a loving life and a life where people care about you, and very often in the simplest circumstances, not primitive. The Epicureans, after all, believed that primitive man wasn't particularly happy. But given the resources we now have, we could have just as much pleasure without necessarily struggling to the top of that mountain.
So, it's interesting. So, on one hand, Epicurus sounds to me like a thoroughly modern guy. That, in some sense, modernity has caught up with the lost wisdom of Epicurus. You told the story about how the Christians and the Stoics kind of beat him out of the shared consciousness for a long time, it seems to me. But he had views, there is no purpose to the universe, live a life, it's governed by chance, but here's how to live in face of that. I mean, that's a modern problematic. That's almost the existentialist problematic there, which is a very modernist movement. But on the other hand, it's got this kind of deep implicit critique of modernity, at least modern capitalism. So he seems to, I don't know where I'm going with this, except that he seems to me like a really complicated figure when we measure him against the lights of modernity.
I think you're absolutely right. One thing I would stress about Epicurus is that he's the first serious psychologist. He's the first one, in the Greek tradition at least, who said, if we are not happy, it's not because with Plato we have failed to see the true immaterial forms that exist in the universe. It's not because we haven't achieved some special wisdom that only Aristotle or only the Stoics can hand to us. It's because we have inner drives that are conflicting and we aren't recognizing the source of our fears.
Sounds
and
positively
they are
Freudian.
creating this.
Was Freud influenced by Epicurus at all?
I don't think he was influenced directly by Epicurus, though he may have been because he was very well versed in the classics. But it has something very similar. These repressed notions, these anxieties that we don't even admit to ourselves, and yet they are causing us to do things that run contrary to what our instincts demand. What in that famous line about the body free from pain and the mind that is free to enjoy pleasurable sensations, what Epicurus says is nature is barking for this. He uses a word that means the barking of an animal. It's at the very core of our being to return to such simple things and rid our minds of these illusions that make us believe we'll be happier if we possess everything, climb every mountain, but more important, dominate every other person, become the wealthiest in the world, sacrifice all values and all good things for these immaterial and ultimately unsatisfying pleasures.
So Freud had this idea that if you could make the patient conscious of the real source of his anxieties and neuroses and all, that would help overcome them. Mm-hmm. Did Epicurus have this therapeutic ideal? If you make us conscious of the real source of our restless striving, we could overcome them and live happier lives?
He did, and Epicurus uses the word therapy, and he actually says a philosophy that cannot cure anxiety is no better than a medicine that cannot cure diseases. And he uses the word therapy, which is a Greek word, but he adds one thing, and I think this is important. He says these things are very hard to do by ourselves. We can think we have said we're not afraid of death. We pretend we're not. We even convince ourselves we're not. But we live in a culture that has inculcated these ideas in us so deeply that they stay around. And so he advocated communities, getting together with people. Some of his disciples would celebrate once a month the day on which he was supposed to have been born. They would carry rings with Epicurus's image on them. There was a kind of cultic quality to the Epicurean circles that formed and that sought in community an alternative to the life of striving and power that they saw going on all around them.
So, David, we don't have too much time left, but I say you've really excited my interest in Epicurus. Hume has always been my favorite philosopher. There seem to be a lot of similarities. I thought Hume admired the Stoics, but maybe just a very quick comment on that before we close.
I think Hume would have a lot in common with the Epicureans. His dialogues concerning natural religion are, I think, permeated by Epicurean sentiment.
David, this has been a really great discussion. I've only scratched the surface of my knowledge of Epicurus, mostly in preparing for this, but he strikes me as a very profound philosopher, and this has been a great conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, John and Ken. It's been a real pleasure.
Our guest has been David Konstan. He's a professor of classics from New York University. He's author of A Life Worthy of the Gods, The Materialist Psychology of Epicurus. So, John, what are you having Epicurean thoughts today?
Oh, absolutely. I'm so anxious to get home and have a nice box of mediocre wine and maybe, heat up some leftovers that won't taste all that bad but won't taste all that good, and maybe go to a not very scintillating movie, and then maybe later on in the evening I'll die.
One thing that strikes me? How contingent in certain ways the history of culture is. Because Epicurus was widely influential for hundreds of years in the ancient world. Hundreds of years. But he lost out to the Stoics and the Christians. And suppose he had not lost out, and we would have been on the modern era 1,500 years earlier. Our cultures would have been founded on modernity a lot earlier. So it's an interesting thing. But you know what? This conversation continues on our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. You can also find out more by following us on Twitter and by visiting our very, very, very active, ever-growing Facebook page.
You can sign up to get the free weekly podcast of Philosophy Talk at our website. Our website is philosophytalk.org. For the final word, we turn to that most refined connoisseur of the fast lane, Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes. So Epicurus is not what we now consider Epicurean. How'd that happen? Well, his philosophy, which preached moderation and friendship as the keys to happiness in life, was definitely materialist. When Christianity came along, materialism was considered heretical and could only lead to the self-satisfied pursuit of pleasure. So Epicurus was repressed and misrepresented for centuries. For some reason, his name became associated with overindulgence in food and wine. Reminds me of the old joke, why are Baptists against sex? Because it might lead to dancing. Anyway, the false Epicurean has come to indicate gourmand, a kind of high-end glutton, better known today by the term foodie, in that irritating way we have in America, making up baby talk words, hippie, veggie, foodie, hoodie, goodies. But glutton isn't quite the right word. An Epicurean repast is more than just a big fancy meal that you wolf down as an exotic feast that you savor. A glutton wears a bib and dribbles rib sauce down his front. An Epicurean wears a silk robe as he nibbles unicorn flank in a plum sauce. Nothing dribbles down his front, or if it does, one of his people will be there to wipe it off discreetly. Jell-O shots are not Epicurean. Infused vodka is. Crystal meth is so not Epicurean. But the occasional puff of cannabis, if its provenance is known, of course, way Epicurean. A feed cap is not Epicurean. A fez? Oh, yeah. Of course, everything I understand about this comes from too much time spent with lurid paperbacks and B-movies. But I know an Epicurean when I see one. Sidney Greenstreet, Robert Morley, or if you prefer a slimmer version, George Sanders. A man with impeccable taste, either sexless or a cad, who is not ruled by appetite. No, appetite is his plaything. Nero, for instance, was a glutton and a sybarite, according to lurid fiction anyway. He fiddled while Rome burned. Private detective Nero Wolfe, on the other hand, is an Epicurean. He likes fine food and conversation, doesn't like to leave the house when he solves a mystery. He cogitates while Rome fiddles. Hercule Poirot, private detective, is also Epicurean. He likes fine dining, hanging out with friends, and solving murders without breaking into too much of a sweat. But if these kinds of cultural tropes are not truly Epicurean, we probably shouldn't dishonor truly Epicurean concepts by calling them that. Maybe we need a new word. Or maybe we don't. After all, we don't even have these cultural figures anymore. No Sidney Greenstreets, no Poirots, or Robert Morleys, or George Sanderses. Closest thing we have today are James Bond villains. And even if they begin a movie as a suave operator who enjoys baccarat, opera, and roast swan bathed in orphan tears, they always end the movie as a murderous thug going down in flames after a final kick to the head from 007. Is 007 a faux Epicurean? No, James Bond has pretensions, but he only likes fine food and drink to impress women. The only true faux Epicureans these days are hipsters. Now, they might eat a corn dog from time to time in place of, say, roast pigeon hearts on velvet, but when hipsters eat a corn dog, they eat it ironically. I gotta go.
The Wisdom of the Ages, in a nutshell, from Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University. Copyright 2012.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
The program is produced by Devin Strolovich. The director of research is Laura McGuire.
Thanks also to Chris Hoff, Merle Kessler, Dave Millar, Jimmy Tobin, Corey Goldman, and Mark Stone.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from the Templeton Foundation and from various groups at Stanford University, the Friends of Philosophy Talk,
and the members of KALW San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.